The world is filled with mysteries, unexplained events, unsettling encounters. These experiences linger in the back of our minds. They send shivers down our spines. They make us question what we thought we knew. Tonight we delve into 3 such stories. Each one is a chilling reminder that the unknown lurks closer than we think. These are true stories. They are about ordinary people facing extraordinary circumstances, stories that will stay with you long after the last word is read. The cabin stood alone, nestled deep within a forest. Its wooden walls creaked softly in the wind. Inside, a young man named David was settling in for the night. He had rented the cabin for a secluded getaway, a chance to escape the city noise. He soon realized his escape had led him to something far more sinister. The night was quiet. Too quiet. David was startled by a sound. A voice. It seemed to come from downstairs. "Who's up there?" the voice whispered. David's heart pounded in his chest. He grabbed a nearby lamp, his hand trembling. David crept down the stairs, his heart pounding in his chest. The wooden steps groaned under his weight, each creak echoing through the silent cabin like a warning. He paused, holding his breath, straining to hear any sound that might indicate he wasn't alone, but the only thing he could hear was the rapid thudding of his own heartbeat. He continued his descent, one cautious step at a time, until he finally reached the bottom. The room before him was shrouded in darkness, the only light coming from the faint glow of the fireplace in the adjacent room. It was empty, but the oppressive silence made it feel anything but safe. Each step creaked, amplifying his fear. He reached the bottom. The room was empty. The dim light from the fireplace cast long, eerie shadows that seemed to dance on the walls, creating an unsettling atmosphere. David's eyes darted around the room, searching for any sign of a movement. He could feel the tension in his muscles, ready to spring into action at the slightest provocation. The silence was deafening, and every creak of the old wooden floorboard seemed to echo his growing anxiety. Shadows danced on the walls, cast by the flickering light of the fireplace. He listened intently. Silence. The kind of silence that felt heavy, almost tangible, pressing down on him. He took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. The cabin, once a place of solace and retreat, now felt like a trap. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The shadows seemed to move with a life of their own, and every flicker of the firelight made his heart skip a beat. Then a loud bang echoed from the kitchen. David froze. Terror surged through him. His mind raced, trying to process what could have caused the noise. Was it the wind, an animal, or something far more sinister? He felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead as he stood there, paralyzed by fear. The sound had shattered the silence, and now the cabin felt even more menacing. He knew he had to move, but his legs felt like they were made of lead. He didn't wait to see what was making the noise. David ran. His instincts took over, and he bolted towards the door, his feet barely touching the ground. The cabin seemed to close in around him as he sprinted through the darkened rooms, the shadows chasing him like phantoms. He could hear his own ragged breathing, the pounding of his heart, and the blood rushing in his ears. He didn't dare look back, afraid of what he might see. He ran out of the cabin into the night, barefoot. The cold ground stung his feet, but he didn't care. The forest loomed ahead, dark and foreboding, but it was his only chance. He plunged into the trees, branches scratching at his skin, the underbrush snagging at his clothes. The night was alive with the sounds of the forest, but all he could focus on was putting as much distance as possible between himself and the cabin. He didn't know where he was going, only that he had to keep moving. He didn't stop running until he reached the safety of his neighbor's porch. His lungs burned and his legs felt like they might give out, but he forced himself to keep going. He pounded on the door, desperate for someone to answer. The porch light flickered on, and he could see the silhouette of his neighbor through the frosted glass. Relief washed over him as the door opened, and he stumbled inside, gasping for breath. The neighbor, a kind old woman, took him in. She called the police. Her presence was a balm to his frayed nerves, and he felt a glimmer of hope. She wrapped a blanket around his shoulders and offered him a cup of tea, her calm demeanor helping to steady his racing thoughts. As they waited for the police to arrive, she listened to his story with a sympathetic ear, her eyes filled with concern. The responding officers found no one in the cabin. They searched every room, every corner, but there was no sign of an intruder. The cabin was empty, just as David had left it. The officers assured him that they would continue to investigate, but without any evidence, there was little they could do. David felt a sense of frustration and helplessness. He knew what he had heard, what he had felt, but there was nothing to prove it. But David couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Even in the safety of his neighbor's home, he felt a pair of unseen eyes following his every move. He glanced over his shoulder constantly, his paranoia growing with each passing moment. The sense of unease was overwhelming, and he couldn't help but wonder if he would ever feel safe again. His landlord, a strange and solitary man, became the prime suspect. David had always found him to be a bit odd, but now his eccentricities seemed more sinister. The landlord had been acting strangely in the days leading up to David's terrifying experience, and it was hard to ignore the coincidence. The police questioned him, but he denied any involvement, his demeanor calm and collected. He had been acting strangely in the days leading up to David's terrifying experience. There had been odd noises coming from his apartment, and he had been seen lurking around the cabin at odd hours. David couldn't shake the feeling that his landlord knew more than he was letting on. The man's behavior was erratic, and his explanations for his actions were vague and unconvincing. The landlord's alibi was shaky at best. He claimed to have been out of town, but there were no witnesses to corroborate his story. His nervous demeanor during the police interrogation only added to David's suspicions. The officers pressed him for details, but his answers were inconsistent and evasive. It was clear that he was hiding something, but without concrete evidence, there was little they could do. But there was no concrete evidence to connect him to the events at the cabin. The police searched the property thoroughly, but they found nothing that could link the landlord to the incident. The lack of evidence was frustrating, and it left David feeling vulnerable and exposed. He couldn't shake the feeling that the danger was still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike again. The year was 2013. The town was quiet, peaceful. A young woman named Sarah walked home from her late shift at the diner. The streetlights cast long shadows. The silence was broken only by the sound of her own footsteps. She noticed a van. It was moving slowly, as if following her. Sarah quickened her pace. Her heart started to race. The van sped up too. It stayed close behind her. Fear coiled in her stomach. She turned a corner, hoping to lose the vehicle. But the van followed. It suddenly sped off into the night, leaving Sarah shaken but relieved. Section 5. A gruesome discovery, unmasking the horror. In the heart of the forest, where the trees whispered secrets and shadows danced, a chilling tale began to unfold. Sarah continued walking, her heart still pounding. The forest seemed to close in around her, each step echoing in the eerie silence. She could feel the weight of the darkness pressing down, making it hard to breathe. She rounded another bend in the road and stopped in horror. Her breath caught in her throat as she saw something that made her blood run cold. A group of teenagers stood huddled together, their faces pale and drawn. They were whispering frantically, their eyes wide with fear. They pointed to something on the ground. Sarah's heart raced as she followed their gaze. It was the body of a woman. She lay there, motionless, her clothes torn and dirty. The sight was both tragic and terrifying. Her lifeless eyes stared vacantly at the night sky. The police arrived quickly, their flashing lights casting eerie shadows on the trees. The small town was in shock. News of the gruesome discovery spread like wildfire, leaving the community in a state of disbelief and fear. A murder had never happened there before. The town had always been a peaceful place where everyone knew each other and crime was almost non-existent. The van became the focus of the investigation. It was found parked near the scene, its windows dark and its presence ominous. Witnesses said it had out-of-state plates. The van's mysterious driver was nowhere to be found, adding to the growing sense of dread. But whispers of the van and its mysterious driver continued to haunt the town for years to come. The forest, once a place of beauty and tranquility, now held a dark secret that would never be forgotten. Section 6. The unsettling call. A prank gone wrong? The phone rang. It was late, almost midnight. Emily jolted awake. Her heart pounded in her chest. She fumbled for the phone. The caller ID was blocked. "Hello?" she whispered. Silence. Then a click. The line went dead. Emily hung up. She tried to shake off the unease creeping up her spine. She went to the window. Something caught her eye. A figure stood on her lawn, hidden in the shadows of a large oak tree. The figure was tall and wearing a dark hooded cloak. Emily's breath caught in her throat. Section 7. Confronting the figure, unveiling the truth. The night was still, the air thick with tension. Emily's heart pounded in her chest as she stood alone in the cabin, the only light coming from a dim bulb above the front door. Fear propelled Emily toward the front door. She had heard strange noises outside, and her curiosity mixed with dread. She couldn't ignore it any longer. She had to know who was out there. The darkness seemed to close in around her as she peered into the night, searching for any sign of movement. She threw open the door, her breath visible in the cold night air. The creak of the hinges echoed in the silence, sending a shiver down her spine.
"Who are you? What do you want?"
she called out, her voice trembling but determined. The silence that followed was deafening, each second feeling like an eternity. The figure stepped into the light. It was a teenager. His face was partially obscured by the hood of his sweatshirt, but Emily could see the glint of mischief in his eyes. He was wearing a mischievous grin under his hood. The sight of his smirk made Emily's blood boil. She'd been terrified, and here he was, treating it like a joke. "Just messing around, ma'am," the teenager mumbled, his voice lacking any real remorse. He seemed to find the whole situation amusing. He and his friends ran off into the night, their laughter echoing through the trees. Emily watched them go, a mix of relief and anger swirling inside her. Emily stood there, shaking her head, relieved but furious. The prank had gone too far, and the fear it had instilled in her was real. The prank had gone too far. She felt a deep sense of violation, knowing that her sanctuary had been breached by a group of careless teenagers. The experience left her feeling vulnerable. She sat on the steps of her cabin, reflecting on the night's events. The fear had been real, and the sense of danger had been palpable, a stark reminder that even in the supposed safety of her own home, danger could lurk just outside. Emily knew she would never forget this night, and the lesson it had taught her about the fragility of her sense of security. Section 8. Reflections: the enduring power of fear. These three stories, though vastly different, share a common thread. They tap into our deepest fears: the fear of the unknown, the fear of the dark, the fear of what lurks just beyond our sight. These fears are primal, universal. They transcend time and place. These stories also remind us that even in the most mundane of settings, the extraordinary can occur. A quiet cabin in the woods, a peaceful walk home, a late-night phone call. These seemingly ordinary moments can quickly transform into something unsettling, something unforgettable. Section 9. Conclusion: embracing the unexplained. We may never know the full truth behind these encounters, the identity of the whisperer in the cabin, the driver of the van, the motive behind the unsettling prank call, but that is part of what makes them so compelling. They force us to confront the unknown, to acknowledge that some things may never be fully explained. These stories are a testament to the enduring power of mystery. They remind us that the world is a vast and enigmatic place, and sometimes the most unsettling experiences are the ones that stay with us long after the event itself has passed.